This exercise could decrease the amount of time and money you spend on your mental health, and most therapists don't even bother with it. My name is Kev, and I am a former therapist who quit my private practice to start a public practice in order to share the mental health tips, tricks, and tools that I think everybody should know before deciding to go to therapy or not. So please do not consider this as a replacement for therapy. It's not a replacement for therapy. It's more like a prequel to therapy. It's pre-therapy. In this video, I'm going to go over what I consider to be a highly important yet highly underrated initial step in moving towards your mental and emotional health goals. I call it internal systems mapping. I'm going to give you a sense of what it is, and I'm going to give you an example of what it looks like. But first, I want to provide a little backstory as to why I think this matters. I once got an email from my tattoo artist, and in the email, he said he would be increasing his hourly rate. But he explained that this wasn't just because of inflation, it was actually because his skill set had reached a level where he was able to do quality work, but at a shorter amount of time. Therapists are just like this. If you've ever tried to search for a therapist online, you've probably been baffled at the wide range of rates associated with them. You might find two therapists that seem to have identical training, but one is $150 an hour and the other is $300 an hour. But if the more expensive therapist is also the more experienced therapist, which sadly is not always the case, even though it should be, well then that more expensive / experienced therapist may very well be able to get you towards your mental and emotional health goals faster, thus saving you money overall. Therapy consumers, though, at least in my experience, are not really trained to think like this. We see a lower number and think that sounds more affordable. I'll be able to get more sessions, which equals more help for me, and we go that way. And I am not here, at least not today, to get into the weeds about cost of therapy. In short, I believe it's all too expensive, which is why I'm doing content like this. I am here today, though, to share one of the reasons why more experienced therapists tend to get clients to their goals faster. It is because they can swiftly translate and decode a client's presenting concern, which just means the thing that they've reached out about, and they can connect that thing to a clinical theory with a set of clear and concise steps. In other words, they take your shit, your problem, and they pair it with its underlying mechanisms, and they offer a set of steps that you might work on together towards an eventual solution. And this Kendrick ad for Cash App is actually a really good example of this in a different field. The guy on the right explains his money problems to Kendrick, who listens and then translates to the guy on the left.
Basically what he is saying, he saved up his money to get a local barbershop. He then made a friendly business wager with Peanut in hopes to secure more money for his business, but eventually losing it all with one roll of the dice. Ray, what you think?
Who explains some potential solutions in a jargony type of way, which Kendrick then decodes and passes back to the guy on the right.
Basically, bro, what he's saying is slow money wins the race.
For our purposes, the guy on the right would be like a therapy client. The guy on the left would be like a database of theory and tools. And Kendrick would be like a therapist, which, if we're being honest, he basically is in real life too. But if Kendrick doesn't have enough experience with either side, the process can't flow as smoothly. Let's take a look at this in a psychotherapy context. So when people reach out for support, especially if it's their first time reaching out for support, they tend to, of course, not use any jargony language, and they tend to speak in very straightforward, often very blunt, evocative statements. I've always really appreciated this during my time as a therapist, because if somebody reaches out to me with something like, I am a doormat in my relationship, well then I instantly have a better vibe on the person and the problem they're facing, as opposed to them reaching out with something like, I want to discuss my relationship. However, I am a doormat is going to take a little bit of Kendrick translation before we can get in there and create a clinical roadmap. Here's how a therapist might go about doing that. So what we have here is the initial client statement, the thing they reached out about, their presenting concern, the doormat thing. And fortunately for us, it has embedded within it a problem, I am a doormat, but also a potential goal. I don't want to be a doormat anymore. And next, I might ask myself, Okay, so what department of skills might this goal require? This one is quite clear that it's in the department of relationships, and for the purposes of this exercise, I'm also going to assume that the person means romantic relationships. What comes up next for me is a sub-department of romantic relationships, boundaries. So I'll plot that here, and as I do that, my brain wants to split this into two: assertiveness and self-worth. Because in my experience, this work may involve getting some reps of behavioral skills, assertiveness, as well as some emotional skills related to self-worth. And now we see our map really start to open up, because within assertiveness, we have a series of skill sets that might make good starting places for this client, as well as self-worth associated topics, like shame, which may open up an exploration about things like guilt and healthy shame versus unhealthy shame, which we would work with in two different ways. Then, if we follow the self-talk part of our map, we might find this inner critic loop where telling ourselves we are a doormat has caused us to avoid seeking help, which causes the problem to persist, which gives our inner critic even more ammunition. These loops may actually be the internalized voice of an external person, somebody in our lives, past or present, that we are now mistaking for our own inner monologue. Which brings us to another branch off point in the map: past relationships and primary caregivers. Because what would an internal systems map be if it did not all lead back to your father? Dad? But for real though, if a therapist is less experienced, they may be less open to a variety of starting points. And even worse, they may force you towards a starting place that they're comfortable with, but you may not feel it's the best fit. And if the person who reached out feeling like a doormat wants to focus exclusively on practical, present-day tools that are related to their current romantic relationship, well, then they may not be down to unpack some early childhood stuff. And that's their perfect right. Now, please keep in mind that this example map is simply where my brain went based on my past experience related to this hypothetical client. I don't know if this is where the work would actually go. It's just a map to get things started. And it would obviously be more useful if there's a Kendrick in the mix working on it with you. However, many of us don't have a Kendrick in the mix. And even if we do have a therapist, therapists don't always work like this. They don't often work like this. Which is why I'm going to start sharing maps like this and skills associated with them in hopes that it helps empower people to find a more accessible starting point. Because ideally, when we start a change process, like therapy for example, we would be doing so from a clearly understood and agreed upon starting place. But in order to do that, we must first understand what our options for a starting place are as they pertain to our particular presenting concern. Any place here could be a starting place. And I don't say that to overwhelm. I say that in part so we can have a better feel for why it is that our internal experience is sometimes so overwhelming, because there's so many moving parts. I also think it's important to map this stuff out with some support if we need it, because it helps give us a sense of agency, and not necessarily agency around the entire problem itself yet, but agency around selecting an entry point with which to enter the problem and move towards a solution. You would not accept a redesign of your home without seeing a blueprint. Why would you accept a redesign of your mind without seeing a map?